Hi guys. It is a Saturday evening. I have a drink. I have some modeling materials, and I thought I would show you the process of making an architectural scale model. So grab a drink yourself, turn on some good music, and model along with me if you want to. So these are the things I have. I have, firstly, a cutting mat. This is important because it lets you cut with your X-acto knife without scoring whatever beautiful surface you have underneath. I also have a couple pieces of chipboard. This is like, what ply is this? This is 50 point, which I think is maybe 5 millimeters, if you can see the thickness there. It's pretty rigid, holds its shape really well. I think it'll be perfect for what I want to do. I also have an X-acto knife. I would also keep some other replacement blades handy for replacement. I have a pencil, I have a ruler, I have an eraser. I also have some masking tape or painter's tape to help me assemble. Oh, I also have 2 types of glue. And I also have a couple sketches of what I want to be modeling. So once you have all those ingredients, we can go ahead and get started. So the most important thing is this sketch. I just made up a design of a building that I think would be interesting to make.
Flashback. End of flashback.
And I've done some dimensioning, so I have some numbers annotated all around the edges. And it's not really at a scale, I just kind of drew it arbitrarily on a piece of gridded paper, so each box represents a unit. So this side is 6 units, this side is 12 units, so on and so forth. And I'll use this to implement a scale to build from. Just to space this out, I think I'm going to say each unit is going to be ½ an inch. So for example, if this side is 6 units, it's going to be 3 inches. So that's the scale I'm going to use, is going to be 1/2 of an inch equals a unit. And then again, 12 units on this side would be 6 inches. So to get started, I'm going to start with the bottom and looking at my sketch that one side is 6 units, the other side is 12 units. So I will make my bottom piece, this section right here, is going to be 3 inches by 6 inches. So this will go fairly quickly and easily, I think. Oops. So I'm just going to get a piece of chipboard. I'm going to measure 6 inches at 2 points. So now I have, this is 6 inches. And I'm drawing a little bit darker than I usually would so that it shows up on camera so you guys can see. Actually, let me just use a pen for this, just to make sure. You guys should use a pencil though, in case you make some errors. Okay, there's 6 inches. And now I'll measure 3 inches. And there we go. There's our bottom piece. So now the fun part, cutting it out. So you could use scissors for this. An X-acto blade is traditionally the tool that's used for model making because it doesn't require the shearing action of scissors. So it's a much more kind of clean way to cut. So what I'm going to do is I have a blade here, nice and sharp, and I'm just going to line up my metal ruler, make sure it's metal, not plastic, so it doesn't cut through the plastic, And I'm just going to start in the corner here and holding the knife straight up and down. You don't want it kind of off to the side. We don't want to bevel it. We'll get to that, but that's for another section. So I'm just going to start making some cuts. And instead of doing like one really big deep one, I'm just going several times lightly but firmly and just making that same cut over and over again until I kind of can pry it up. I can use my hands to kind of see that it's now severed from the other piece. So just do the same thing on this side. Pretty self-explanatory, but I think good craft is important for these models, especially if they're simple like this one. And you'll get the hang of it. Making sure your edges are clean, making sure your blade is new. Once you have a couple cuts, sometimes I like to take the ruler away because then I can really focus on visually what I'm doing, what I'm cutting. And you'll be able to feel it too once you've cut through. And voila, there's the first piece. So I'm going to do this for each of the sides and come back in a second when I've done all that. I find it's also useful to label your pieces. This one won't be as difficult, but in the case where you have tons of different pieces, you want to make sure you label them so you know which way to assemble them in. Again, in pencil or something light, so you can either erase it, even if it is on the good side of your model. So this one is the bottom. And I'm doing, I'll call this side 1, and this is side 2. Curves are difficult. There's not really a good way to do them. You kind of have to take them in tiny little chunks as you go around. The tighter the curve, the more chunks you'll have to do. And you kind of just have to comprise it of a bunch of little straight cuts. Sometimes for more shallow curves you can do it, but as they start to get tight here, it's going to get a little difficult. Just be careful, use a steady hand, and don't try to cut too deep on any one pass, just go lightly. There we go. A little rickety towards the top, but not too bad. So right now I'm just going to start assembling these pieces, making sure that my tape will not destroy this chipboard or like pull it apart too much. Okay, so I've now just done what is called dry fitting, and that is when you kind of put all the pieces of the puzzle together without any glue or any permanent adhesive. So I can still dismantle this and take it apart. And dry fitting is really good for testing. And you can see we're already running into some fundamental issues because of the thickness of the material. So because this chipboard has a 5mm thickness, it means that the pieces can't fit together perfectly. And what I mean by that is if I cut all these pieces to their perfect dimension, what is going to happen is that one piece of the material is going to have to fit behind the other, which is going to cause a discrepancy in the measurements. So you can see what's happening here, because this top piece is sitting directly on top of our side facade. This dimension is no longer 3 inches, it's now 3 inches and 5mm, or whatever the thickness of this is. So to fix that, you either have to account for that when you're building. So for example, you'd have to make this piece, you'd have to subtract the thickness from the side that's going to sit on top of it, so that this would sit and this would be 3 inches exactly. Or we have to miter all the edges, which is when you
Good idea.
do a 45-degree cut into the thickness of the material, and that will make them fit together corner to corner. So that is what I'm going to tackle, just to show you guys how to do that. And then we'll have a much better situation. You'll also notice I've skipped the top lid of this, and that is because I'm going to show you a technique for working with curved surfaces. Okay, so mitering is a little tricky, but once you get your head wrapped around it and your hand wrapped around it, you'll get the hang of it. So what I'm going to do is essentially cutting a 45-degree strip off of each side of the material that will be touching another side. So for example, the bottom I will do to all 4 sides, because there's going to be a side, 2 sides, and a front and back facade sitting also on this edge. So because these have to share an edge, you have to cut 45 degrees away from each of them so they can meet up in the middle. So to do that, I'm just kind of shimmying my knife in at a 45-degree angle. And this takes quite a bit of practice to get your pressure and your angle right. And you can kind of inspect to see if you see like some width left. So I have to go a little bit deeper, a tiny bit. You're definitely not going to get it perfect on your first time. That looks pretty good. And then I'll do it to one of these sides as well, just to show you what's going on. Put this in the middle so you guys can see better. Okay, so now hopefully you can see the difference. This piece is mitered, this piece is not. So you can see the difference in the silhouette of the edge there, the edge condition. So now these can fit together much more harmoniously. And now the width of the material doesn't matter because we've mitered it out so that they fit from the outside exactly corner to corner. So that's what I can do to all these pieces, and then we'll come back and put them all together. The one exception for the mitering, I'm not going to miter this curved edge because I'm going to show you how to make a piece that just sits right on top of it. So I'm going to accept that from this mitering process. So now all of our pieces are beautifully mitered, so I'm going to go ahead and glue them together. And I'm just going to use a scrap piece of chipboard for this next process. Just going to cut a little bit off of this. is you want something that you can put some glue on. So now I have all my pieces laid out here, and I can show you how to glue them up. So what I usually like to do is just take my glue, and I'm just going to put a strip right here. And that will allow me to kind of dip and dunk. I find this works better than putting it directly onto the piece. It gives you a little bit more control and finesse, and it won't leave your model so gloopy. So like I said, just a thin line. And you'll kind of have to make a lot of these as you go, because this one will dry out. So, for example, let's start with the side pieces here. So I'm just going to kind of take my piece, the edge that I want to glue, just kind of dip it into the glue. Make sure I have like a nice thin layer. I'm just going to put it edge to edge since we've mitered them nicely. And then I'm just going to kind of hold it just there for a little bit. So this should set up pretty quickly, but you can see what I'm doing is kind of rigging up this like waiting station or drying station where just take objects that you know are 90 degrees. For example, another piece of your model, or say the side of your glue bottle if you don't want to hold it. But like I said, this should dry pretty quickly. You can see it standing up on its own pretty well. You can also just turn it gingerly on its side. Just make sure that it's at a 90 degrees. I'm using the lines on my cutting mat. You can also use, again, a little jig like this that you know is 90 degrees so that everything's kind of gluing up nicely. And the nice thing about chipboard is that it does have some give and forgivability. It's not like sheet metal or something, so it has some like, you know, flex and mush that you can kind of push and pull to get things even. So while this one's gluing, I'm also going to do this other side. So I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to dip the edge into this glue, kind of like smearing it around like a spatula, making sure it has a nice even layer. I'll do a little bit more. There we go, that looks good. And then I'm going to press it into place over here. Usually it's good to do just one piece at a time, but if you start getting into rhythm and you feel good about it, you can start doing multiple, and that will speed up your modeling process as well. And as you add more pieces, it'll start to get more rigid as the whole thing kind of comes together. It's at its most vulnerable state now when you just have a couple sides. For more complex pieces where you're not just gluing one side at a time, I will definitely just put a bead of glue all the way around. So for example, on these front and back facades, I'll need to glue all three of these edges at once. So I'll just take my glue again. I like to use my finger to kind of get things even. Make sure, there we go. So I'll just slide a thin bead all the way around. The three sides. And like I said, I like to use my finger to kind of clean everything up. Smear some off in some places, smear some on in some places where it needs to be thicker. I find your finger is just a really nice tool for this. You could also use like a paintbrush or something, but I like my finger. All right, so I'm going to take this and apply. Oh, look at those miters coming together. Beautiful. being careful to put even pressure all the way around, making sure all my edges are touching. You can also use our tape trick here. If you don't feel like holding it, you can just tape these edges and corners together, and that'll hold it until the glue dries. If you want to spend this time cutting other pieces or doing anything else. Okay, so now we have all 4 sides, or 5 sides, so now I'm going to stick these 2 top pieces on, and then we'll get to the fun of this little curved part right here. Okay, so for this top curve, what I want to do is cut out a piece that's the width of the top, but long enough to kind of cover this whole circumference here. So I'm going to do that. Back to the cutting board. Okay, so now this can kind of cover the entirety of this, but it needs to bend. And this is a little bendy, but not quite bendy enough. So what I'm going to do is create lots of scores on one side that's going to allow this to curve. So let me show you how to do that. I can do them pretty tight, maybe about every 1/4 of an inch or so. We'll see how that turns out. So I'm just scoring these, which means making incisions but not going all the way through. So instead of doing 5 or 6 of these cuts to go all the way through, I'm just doing 2 or 3 each. Okay, so now we have this beautiful, wiggly little piece of chipboard that can drape so nicely around our curve. So I'm just going to cut this to size. You can see we have some excess here, and then glue that right up. Beautiful. Now that gap is at least not as evident. You can also sand this once this dries with very, very fine grit sandpaper, and that will help too. It'll also help with these kind of gluey edges that inevitably happen. Just take a little bit of sandpaper or even like a nail file and just kind of go in there, get rid of all that stuff. Okay, so whoops. Okay, so now we have fully realized model, sketch. Here's the model. So this is a pretty basic model. There's definitely things you can do to elevate it. I could have cut windows and doors in here. You can also draw like ornamentation. So I can draw in doors and windows to implement a scale. That would be nice as well. You can also paint it, color it. This is what I was talking about before with these kind of ridges that happen when you score. So you can take another material and potentially kind of cover it with that. There's lots of things you can do with this. But that's the basics of model making. And I'm going to use this model here to instruct you guys on some perspective drawing as well.
Architecture. Architecture.